For 2 decades, an unseen force lurked in the shadows, terrorizing a city that had no idea it was being stalked by one of the most dangerous serial killers in history. 13 innocent victims, lives shattered, families destroyed, and a trail of horror that spanned over 20 years. In a case that spanned across decades, one man would evade justice, slipping through the cracks of the system while his reign of terror continued unchecked. From seemingly random attacks to calculated executions, the city was paralyzed by fear, unsure of when or where the next brutal crime would occur. This is the true story of how 13 victims, 20 years, and a relentless killer would leave an entire community in the grips of terror, never knowing if they were the next target. The calm before the storm. Before the terror began, the city was just like any other. A community that lived its day-to-day life, unaware of the predator that was slowly emerging from the shadows. The killer, known only as the Phantom, was a figure who kept to the background, blending in effortlessly with those around him. He was careful, methodical, and patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In the early years of the Phantom's reign, his first few attacks were isolated, with no apparent connection to each other. The victims were of different ages, genders, and backgrounds, with no clear pattern or motive that investigators could immediately discern. The attacks seemed random, almost as if the killer was testing the waters, experimenting with different methods of inflicting pain and terror. For the police, it was a case that was difficult to connect. The first few victims didn't even appear to be linked, leaving authorities uncertain about the true nature of the crimes. They could not have known then that this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch out over the course of 2 decades. The first victims. The first official victim was 22-year-old Sarah Mills, a college student who had been walking home late one evening in 1994. Her body was discovered a day later, dumped in a quiet alleyway. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, but there were no obvious signs of sexual assault or robbery. To investigators, it seemed like an isolated crime, something that might have been carried out by a random stranger or a crime of passion. But when Sarah's body was discovered, there was something chilling about the scene. It had an eerie calm to it, as though the killer had taken his time. It wasn't just the brutal murder that stood out, it was the meticulousness of it. The body had been left in a manner that suggested control, as if the killer had been trying to send a message, but no one knew what that message was. Less than 6 months later, another body was found. This time, it was 18-year-old James McCabe, a local high school student. The same method was used, blunt force trauma to the head. But there were now 2 bodies, both young, both seemingly random, and with no clear connection to each other. But the killer's signature, calm, controlled violence, was becoming clear. The pattern emerges. It was when the third body was discovered that investigators began to suspect something darker was at play. Margaret Jensen, a 29-year-old mother of 2, was found dead in her home in 1996. Unlike the previous victims, Margaret had been bound and gagged before being killed. A chilling pattern was beginning to form. Each of the victims had been killed in a manner that appeared to be carefully planned. Investigators noticed the killer's consistency. There were no rushed decisions, no slip-ups, just cold, calculated precision. It was as if the Phantom had learned from his first 2 murders, refining his methods with each attack. In fact, police soon realized that the Phantom was not just a murderer. He was a predator who was evolving. What made it even more terrifying was that there seemed to be no connection between the victims. They weren't related, they didn't live near each other, and there was no discernible reason why they were targeted. To the people of the city, it seemed that the killer was choosing his victims at random, like a man playing a twisted game where everyone was a pawn. The unseen hand. As the years passed, the body count slowly grew. The Phantom's reign of terror spread throughout the city, leaving investigators and the public desperate for answers. By 1999, there had been a total of 6 victims, and the killings seemed to be accelerating in both brutality and frequency. With each murder, the killer became more brazen, more confident in his actions. The fear that had gripped the community in the early years was now pervasive. People were afraid to leave their homes at night, terrified that they might be the next victim. Women were especially vulnerable, as the majority of the victims were female. The city lived in a state of constant dread, unsure of when the next body would be found or what the next murder would entail. What was even more unnerving was that the killer was never seen or heard. He had mastered the art of staying hidden. There were no witness accounts, no surveillance footage, and no suspects. He moved like a ghost, leaving only death in his wake. Investigators were left to piece together what little evidence they could find, but it seemed as though the Phantom was always one step ahead. The breakthrough. The first real breakthrough in the case came in 2001 when investigators discovered a potential link between the victims. An old, faded cigarette butt found at one of the crime scenes. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. The killer had been a smoker, and the DNA left on the cigarette matched the killer's. However, that lead quickly turned cold, as there were no other significant clues at the scene. For years, the case continued to stall. The killings slowed, but they never stopped completely. In fact, as time passed, the Phantom seemed to have perfected his methods. The murders were now almost indistinguishable from natural deaths. The killer had learned to leave no trace, and the once unrelenting spree of terror became more sporadic. But then, in 2014, a break in the case would come from the most unlikely source. An anonymous tip-off was made to the police, suggesting that they look into an old, seemingly unrelated case. A case that had gone cold for years. This clue would finally bring the investigators closer to the truth than they ever could have imagined. The identity of the Phantom. In 2015, after more than 2 decades of terror, the identity of the Phantom was finally revealed. His name was Thomas Gray, a 47-year-old former construction worker with a history of violence and mental health issues. He had been living under the radar for years, blending in perfectly with the community while secretly planning and executing his brutal killings. Gray's connection to the victims was both chilling and bizarre. He had been a member of a local support group for people with anger issues, and several of the victims had been attending the same meetings. Investigators discovered that Gray had harbored a deep resentment toward the group and felt that they had wronged him in some way. His decision to kill wasn't based on personal grudges against specific people, but rather as a way to exact revenge on the group as a whole. It wasn't just his motive that shocked investigators, it was the fact that he had been living in plain sight for so many years. His ability to blend in and stay undetected for so long was a testament to how careful and methodical he had been in carrying out his crimes. The aftermath. Once Thomas Gray was arrested, the city began to heal, but the scars left by his 20-year reign of terror would never fade. The lives of 13 innocent people had been stolen, and the families of the victims would never be the same. The families of the murdered individuals were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, struggling to find meaning in the wake of such senseless violence. For the survivors, those who had narrowly escaped Gray's violent grasp, the trauma of the experience would never leave them. They would live with the haunting memories of their near-death encounters, knowing that they had been mere seconds away from joining the list of victims. In the end, the case of Thomas Gray serves as a grim reminder that even the most ordinary-looking people can harbor darkness within them. His ability to blend in, manipulate, and stalk his victims for over 2 decades without detection is a chilling testament to the ease with which terror can infiltrate even the most secure communities. As we look back on the terror that gripped the city for 20 years, we are reminded that justice, while delayed, was eventually served. But for the families and communities affected by Gray's actions, justice can never truly undo the pain and loss they experienced. If you found this documentary compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue to raise awareness about the importance of staying vigilant and supporting those who are struggling with mental health issues. Only by working together can we hope to prevent such horrors from repeating themselves. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, The darkest monsters are often the ones who live in plain sight.